We are going from internal correspondence to external correspondence. External, obviously, is now you're actually communicating to the vendor. Usually means written contact with responsible officials of the contractor. That's what we're typically talking about. But sometimes it can include contact to non-agency personnel concerning some aspect of the contractor or its performance, such as an insurance company, a bonding company, etc. So that still can be construed as external correspondence relative to this contract. Many types of such correspondence are mentioned in this class, such as suspension of work, termination, show cause letter, remediation plan requests. These are examples that we talk about of formal external correspondence. External, this is not rocket science. External correspondence should receive the highest scrutiny before being sent to ensure, number one, all internals approvals. Remember, it's not good enough to have internal approval. You need to have internals approval. Most people don't realize that you need that internals. And Mark is, as we speak, making a note of that extraneous S. Highest scrutiny, all internal approvals have been obtained before taking the reference course of action. Even though, as I've already said probably a half hour ago, you speak with one voice, and that one voice is the contract manager in most instances. That person doesn't speak without getting whatever internal approvals are necessary before saying something. Because what you don't want to do is have something go out and then the vendor say, wait a minute, what is this? And question it or something like that, and then somebody else in the agency, someone higher up than the contract manager, finds out and says, wait a minute, we didn't want that. Why did you ever send it? And then you send something to the vendor that basically retracts the first one, and it just shows who's in charge, what's going on there. And although we want contractors to do their jobs and do their job properly, we need to show that we know what's going on too, that we have our act together, and this is part of the way to do that. If you need internal approval, get the internal approval. And something I said excuse me, in the planning class, which many of you didn't attend, but lots of times in specifications, agencies will want to write procedures that will govern internal correspondence and internal approvals. And I will question it, and I'll say, who are you targeting this information to? And they'll say, well, I'm targeting it to the people in the agency because I want them to know what the rules are. And what I say is, we don't put in contract with a vendor anything that pertains to internal activities or internal procedures. The vendor doesn't need to know that. But even it's not in the contract because it's not appropriate for the contract, there still needs to be, and it should be in the contract file, what the procedures are. Who needs to be in the mix to make decisions? And what are the procedures to making sure that you have an official decision internally before it's communicated to the vendor? Because you want to give them consistent direction and not say it, take it back, say something different, take it back, etc. That just means the vendor doesn't know whether to really listen to you this time or wait until you're going to change your direction and tell them something different. So you definitely want the internal approvals before you do external correspondence. And that specifically means the procurement officer and the assistant attorney general. Don't threaten something you don't have the right to threaten. The intended message is clearly conveyed. It is clear what you want, when you want it, and why you're taking this action. And I will use an example that has been said back to me from a vendor that I'm not directly involved with, but this vendor received a letter from an agency that said they couldn't do something. And the vendor continued to do it. And when they were questioned why they continued to do it, they produced this letter and said, I don't interpret this letter as telling me not to do this. It kind of dances around the issue, And maybe I could infer if I wanted to that I wasn't supposed to do it, but I didn't want to infer that I wasn't supposed to do it, so I didn't infer that. To me, it doesn't say what it is alleged that it says. And they showed me this letter, and I said, well, I agree that it doesn't make it crystal clear what it is that you're being told you're supposed to not do. But now that I know they didn't make it crystal clear, let me make it crystal clear. You're not supposed to do it. So, but you shouldn't get there. If you're going to send something to a vendor, make sure it says what you want to say. And if you have to run it through all your internal approvals and your attorney to make sure the words are there, the words are clear, the old adage of say what you mean what you say, do it. Don't send something out that the vendor has to come back to you and say, all right, what does this say? Maybe they might come back to you and say, do you really mean it? And you should say, yes, I mean it because I sent it. But they shouldn't have to come back to you to even find out what it says. Free of errors. The old thing of do as I say, not what I do, not a good procedure. Don't expect error-free quality work from a vendor if what you give them is sloppy. I mean, not that you can't, but it isn't a good presentation if it communicates to them that you don't know how to write and use punctuation and spell things correctly, or are diligent enough to make sure that you have a formal communication going out that just looks and reads bad. You don't want to create an image that we don't know what we're talking about. So you get the approvals, you say it clearly, you have it with proper spelling and grammar and punctuation. Emails to contractor personnel usually are included among external correspondence. If it's coming from you to someone in a position of responsibility in the vendor, regardless of whether it's not in a nice formal letter signed at the bottom in an envelope through the usual mail, if it's email, it is still a communication from you to the vendor. And anymore, probably there's more communication via email than the normal U.S. mail or courier type procedure. So you want the same standards to apply to the emails. The vendor has to understand what you're telling them to do. It has to be clear. You have to have your authority. It should be free of errors, etc. And one thing I always do is after I write an email, I will go back and read it before I send it. And it's surprising how many times when you're writing something, you have half of what you're writing in your mind, and sometimes it's surprising. You will swear that you wrote something because you know you were thinking it, but when you go back and read it, you will find that every now and then there's a word that you just didn't get around to putting in there. But you know it was in your mind, but vendor only can get what's on the paper or in the email. So go back and proof it to make sure those first three things are there. Okay, any questions about external correspondence? This is where we're putting it up a notch. And we want to make sure we communicate properly, shows that we are on top of things, know what we're doing, and we're informing of something, we're requiring something, so we might need to make sure it's done properly. Any questions? Okay. Come on. Gary?
Take advantage of that.
I guess he got tired of listening.
No way.
Listening to me, nah, can't happen. Who could ever say that? Testing. Now, this is not going to happen for most activities, but depending on what you're getting, if it's a tangible item, if you're receiving in construction, for instance, where things have to be tested to tolerances, has to withstand certain weight things. You have to be able to withstand a 200-pound load or a 80-mile-an-hour wind or something like that. Or if it's some piece of equipment that has to be able to withstand certain temperature extremes, whatever it is, testing might be a requirement, that they actually provide some kind of a testing laboratory report or something like that that validates that a requirement has been verified as being met by an independent testing entity. So you have design testing and you have functional testing. What I've been talking about is primarily the design testing. Checks whether the contractor's product conforms to an objective standard in the contract. If you have this type of thing, think of whether you want to have a testing requirement to validate that the vendor met whatever you have specified. You probably can think of instances such as the bridge in between St. Paul and Minneapolis back around 5 years ago, Interstate 35 that collapsed into the Mississippi River, and I think 11 people died. And when they went back, they found out the vendor didn't follow the blueprints. They didn't use the materials that were specified to connect things or something like that. And in this instance, unfortunately, under the right circumstances, because they used improper products, whatever it was, the bridge collapsed. Very catastrophic results. But important to have testing that not only that you've specified the right thing, but the vendor is giving you what you've specified.
Question.
Yes.
Obviously, the people who were building that bridge had the team of people that were supposed to meet the industry standards and whatever standards. You'd be adding a lot of expense to the contract to bring an outside agency to verify and audit it. I mean, you get into this endless, is anybody doing their job kind of thing, you know what I mean?
The degree to which you implement any of these activities will be related to the importance of what you're getting, the expense of what you're getting, the potential consequence if you don't get it. Obviously, if you are ordering a box of pencils, you may not require any independent testing, or the testing may simply be that they include some kind of a testing analysis that said it was a number 2 pencil and it did have X amount of writing life or something like that, which they should have as a routine part of their corporate activity. So it can get from not requiring anything and simply seeing whether it works for something like a pencil to before we put up a bridge, yes, we're going to spend a lot of money to come and test it and validate it and make sure the right materials were used and they were put together in the right process and everything seems okay. It's all relative. And your decisions are which of these things to employ. For any given contract, what do you do, what don't you do? And even if you do a certain activity, you decide to what degree you do it. Do you accept something that they have from some other source, or do you require them to go out and get a new one just for you?
Because that's a real hard part.
Right. The main thing we're doing is just giving you like the whole shopping list of things to consider. And for anyone in here, probably a given percentage of what I'm saying will not apply to you. And there will be times you'll tune out because you'll say, I'm never going to do that. And that's fine, because there's someone else, and when I'm talking about that, will say, that's exactly what I want. Well, hopefully someone will say that yes, it's something I wanted to hear. And that's the thing when you're doing a generic presentation, one size fits all. And so we don't customize, and you get what you get from it. Hopefully, overall, you get a lot out of it, but we're going to give you the gamut. So, moving along with the gamut. Functional user acceptance testing checks whether the contractor's product solves the problem stated in the contract. Does it achieve the result? So that's not an objective test, usually. I guess it could be in some circumstances, but usually it's, does it achieve what we said it had to achieve? And that may not be testing in the same sense as a laboratory test. But it means someone's going to go and check it against some standard, some pre-identified acceptance standard to see whether it measures up to that pre-identified standard. Testing. Depending on the circumstances, testing, inspection, etc. can be done at one or more stages of the production development of a product, report, creative strategy, etc. Testing can be done on 100%, so you can test everything you get. If you're going to the moon, you want to make sure every single component was tested, not just that 50 out of 100 worked okay. Or a sampling. A sampling, then you have to, in your specifications, say what the percentage of sampling is, whether it is 20%, 10%, 5%, or at least have the vendor tell you in their technical proposal what their sampling level is and their sampling techniques are. Otherwise, a formal, and if you do not have it in the specifications, the broken record I'm going to say over and over and over is if it isn't in there in the specs, if you find out afterwards that this seems like something that's appropriate, you can always go to the vendor and try to get them to incorporate it via a modification. And then the issue is, will they do it? And if they'll do it, will they do it for no more money? Or whether they're going to say, fine, but you need to pay me more. And then you have to decide whether it's worth what they're saying. So it's always better to have it up front. Sometimes an informal agreement might be okay, sometimes. Whatever the mechanism for testing, whether it's lab tests, inspections, focus groups, satisfaction surveys, etc., it should be assured that the final product outcome, output outcome of a contract is obtained before final payment is authorized. If you require these type of activities to validate before you make payment, then follow through, have it done, and if it doesn't test out, either have them correct it before you make payment or only make partial payment of what is acceptable, whatever the case may be. There's always, as I say over and over, it's one thing to have the right to do things, but you need to follow through and actually do them. That's where you get results. That's where you change vendor behavior, not just currently, but in the future. It's perception. If vendors believe they can get away with things, there are vendors out there that will try to get away with things. If vendors believe they can't get away with things, then there are some vendors that won't even respond if they figure that you're not a patsy, that they can't get away with it, or they're going to come in knowing that they need to perform and need to price accordingly. And you set that stage by, at some point in time, setting up the premise that you're going to require performance, and in so many words, if they're not ready to perform, don't come back the next time. Don't expect full payment this time and don't come back the next time. If you're not going to do what our specs say and our contract says, don't bother, because it's going to be a headache for you and a headache for me, and you're not going to get away with it. That's what all of this is about. And I have actually had vendors, and I'll give my famous story from the distant past. One time at a housekeeping contract for the Rosewood Center. This was back, I think, in '89. And there was a vendor who had a reputation as being a very good vendor in this field who had not bid on a single one of our housekeeping contracts for something like 5 years. And of course, at one time, DHMH had, one time there were 26 different facilities because it was all the existing ones plus juvenile service facilities, etc. So one time we had lots of housekeeping contracts, and Rosewood was the biggest. And so we had this vendor that had not responded in 5 years. And because of circumstances, one particular procurement I did for the first time as a sealed proposal procurement at Rosewood. And this vendor responded. Hadn't responded in 5 years, this vendor responded. And at the oral presentation, before we got into the actual formal presentation, while we're sitting across the table, I said to the people that were there from the vendor, just said, out of curiosity, what made you or what prompted you to come in and bid this time when we haven't seen you in 5 years? We've been sending the notices to you, we've been sending the specs to you, and nothing has come back for 5 years. So why this time? And what the vendor said to me has stayed with me, obviously, since 1989. And what they said was, well, we've been reading all the specs you've been sending over the past 5 years, and we look at them and we see that all you want is low bid, all you want is the cheapest vendor you can get, or the cheapest price you get, and our perception is you were not seeking a quality vendor, and since we're a quality vendor, we knew we could not compete with the vendors who would come in, who would offer you the lowest price without the intent of performing. We read these specifications and we see these specifications are different. We perceive that these specifications want quality. And now you're in our ball game, the delivery of a quality product. And so we are coming after this particular contract. We're going to go after it aggressively. We're going to seek to win it because this is different. This is quality. And when you're going after quality, we're now on an equal footing or a better footing than everybody else. And in that particular instance, as fate would have it, that vendor won. They not only had the best technical offer, but they were the lowest price in addition. Once there was a minimum acceptable quality level, and that just validated that if you convey that your expectation is for quality and proper performance, good vendors will respond and bad vendors either won't or they'll respond with a price that is adequate to do the job, which means you're better off. So that's my famous story. Contract payment issues. Part of contract management is paying the vendor when they're supposed to get paid and not paying them when they're not supposed to get paid and knowing the difference. All right, this is the point that you're probably, for the next half hour, this is perhaps going to be tedious. And if I say that, that really means something. Measuring progress. For many state contracts, it is easy to determine if the contractor has completed work and is entitled to full or partial payment. If I'm ordering a dozen boxes of pencils, did I get a dozen boxes of pencils? Are they yellow pencils or green pencils, or the color of the external? Are they number 2 pencils versus 2.5? Do they have erasers? If they were specified to be erasers, I can look and I can see, were there 2 dozen? Were they number 2 pencils? Did they have the proper color? Did they have the eraser? All that stuff is readily observable. There's other things that are not of that nature, that you need to really have some mechanism to try to figure out, is the vendor working properly, doing the job they're supposed to, and are they entitled to money? So those are the things that we're going to start focusing on now, the ones that are not so easy to determine whether the vendor is entitled to payment. For other contracts, measuring progress or the stage of contract completion may be difficult, and that's what we're going to focus on. Stage of completion, how much of the contract is done to this point in time, and knowing how much of the contract is done or what progress the vendor has made will tell me how much the vendor should be paid. Primarily, what you're talking about here is either a time and materials type of contract, labor only, and labor only is basically the time part of time and materials. It's time and materials without the materials. And cost reimbursement is, I'm supposed to reimburse you for allowable and allocable costs, whatever they are, up to a cap. So those are the things where it may be these type of contracts may be difficult to ascertain stage of completion. Every now and then I think I hear noises. If it is not easily discernible how much of a contract has been completed, it is not easy to determine how much of the contract amount to pay the contractor. If I don't know if you've done 50%, I don't know whether you're entitled to be paid 50% of your contract price. The slides in this section provide some guidelines and advice to help determine when a contractor performing under a contract without clear deliverable milestones is entitled to payment and how much. And this is a situation where it's not that you have not properly identified the milestones, it's just it's not appropriate to have milestones. If you're doing an audit contract and the vendor has to go out and delve into file cabinets and everything like that, how do you know how far the vendor has gone into doing their work? If they've looked in 2 file cabinets, is that 50% of the work? Is it 10% of the work? You just don't know. All you know is they say they've gone through 2 file cabinets, and here's a bill. So are they entitled to money? Key principle for payments under state contracts: payment after performance. Not an absolute. Not saying there cannot be a circumstance where you pay in advance. But for the most part, we pay after we get. The old thing of possession is 9/10 of the law. We don't want the vendor to have our money and we don't have what we've already paid for and we're trying to get the money back. Or trying to get the vendor to now perform after they've been paid and trying to get either the money back or the performance. The incentive of vendors is money. They want to get money. They want to get money as soon as possible. And so you holding the money is the incentive for them to do the work to trigger the payment of the money. So for the most part, this is the role, and you have to have a good reason to go to do anything other than that. There are appropriate circumstances. I'm probably going to say, well, I am going to say right up here. Not absolute, preferred. Now, for DHMH, in many instances when you're doing with mental hygiene administration, development of disabilities, alcohol and drug abuse, you probably are going to pay your nonprofit entities at least some amount of money in advance, because nonprofits historically don't have much money, don't have a lot of capital, don't have a lot of reserves, and if they had to pay thousands of dollars up front and wait a month or 6 weeks to get anything back, a lot of them would have great difficulty. So that's one instance where the norm is to pay at least some amount in advance. Correct? And I think they get 6 payments in the course of a year. They get 15% in advance, I think is the standard. And then after like 2 months, they get another 15%, something like that. But they get a small amount up front, and they have to validate the expenditure of the upfront payment before they get the next installment of payment, etc. So it can happen, but you have to have procedures in place to make sure you're not just giving them money and you're not getting any deliverable for it. So you're going to keep hearing that over and over from me. Pay for having gotten something, for the most part. Another thing you're going to hear is you want to put in the contract what the payment terms are. And this is another thing that's surprisingly how frequent I will read specifications. And even if you have an amount of money the vendor has bid to provide an activity, there's nothing that says when the vendor can get it. When do they get the whole thing? Can they get part of it at a certain time? Or do they have to wait till the entire contract is done and every single aspect completed before they get a cent? What are the payment terms? And you need to think about it. You need to put it in there, because for vendors, this is the first thing they're going to want to know. What am I supposed to do? When do I get paid for it? And this is an instance where there's frequently issues of conflict with your vendors if you don't put this in the specifications in advance, and it's not in the contract. Then you have to work this out during the course of the contract. And sometimes it's not an issue, but other times it is. Other times you will get into actual heated disagreement with your vendor because they want their money, they feel they're entitled to it, and you keep saying no. And sometimes you're right, and there's sometimes I've seen agencies that are wrong in holding up money of how they have done it. So put it in the contract to begin with. It isn't sufficient to identify just the work to be done and the price. When the price will be paid also must be specified. Otherwise, I knew I heard something that time. Except for obvious situations, the ambiguity over payment terms could be a point of contention with contractors. One of the things you've heard from me is ambiguity is bad. To the degree that you can avoid ambiguity, you do it because it saves yourself headaches. And
it's not only work in many contracts that we pay for. It could be IT related. Maybe they're supplying computers, maybe they're supplying software, maybe they're supplying some other maintenance from a third party. Confusion often comes about because those items may not be quite correctly specified. So for example, when we say vendor shall supply, take a 5-year contract, vendor will supply software renewal.
All right, before you go there,
Or do you have a slide for that?
Yes.
Okay.
we're talking about vital records, right?
Could be.
We have vital records in there. Because you gave me that example. So, we'll get to the example Gary was going to bring up. Let's see, when? Lack of payment terms. If payment terms are not specified in the contract and payment circumstances are also not covered by common industry practice or the Uniform Commercial Code, and even though the state is not bound by the Uniform Commercial Code, but at least that is something that people is recognizable, that if it's typically paid in a certain time frame under UCC, even though we don't have to follow that, usually it's an easy way to say, since the UCC requires that, that's when we'll pay if it's not otherwise specified. But if it isn't, if there is not an absolute established industry practice or something else, you need to specify. And even if there isn't established and you want to do something different, you need to specify. So if you don't have the payment terms in your specification, the agency risks, here are the dangers. Risk is always present. Number one, acquiescing to the contractor and perhaps paying in advance. And I mean that not so much literally as the vendor sends you a bill, you pay the bill, and you don't know, maybe you're paying way more than you should for what has been done to that point in time. So you are paying in advance even though you don't even know it. And lots of times, believe me, agencies acquiesce to vendors. And I have one example that I don't think we'll get to today that is on here that I still find it's so absolutely incredible. I still find it unbelievable it even happened, but it did. Of where an agency just paid money and did things, and when you look at every single thing they did, you scratch your head and say, how can anybody who was not on the payroll of the contractor agree to these things that the contractor had billed for? I mean, either you can't read, you can't think, or you're being paid off or something like that, because it's just so incredible otherwise. So that's one of the things. Causing strife with the contractor over the lack of payment, point of friction. And another thing I've said routinely is you and your contractor should be working in uniform to satisfy the objective of the contract. That's why you're obtaining a contractor. And it should be a harmonious relationship where they are an extension of you and they're doing what you can't do, etc. And that's when this whole thing works optimally. What you don't want is where you're spending a lot of your time and they're spending a lot of their time where you're fighting each other. That's where it doesn't work optimally, and that's where we have problems, so we try to avoid that. And the other thing we try to avoid are contract claims, because again, that's more work, and there's hardship, there's animosity perhaps, and maybe vendors aren't going to do what you want them to do. And in particular, something that was said the first day of something that can happen and sometimes does happen, where if a vendor feels they're part of the team, if they feel like they're part of the agency in delivering needed services to the public or a given set of clients or something like that, there are times that if everything is harmonious, that they will do more than actually required by the contract. And that certainly isn't going to happen if you're fighting each other. Then the fight is whether they will do what is required by the contract. Don't even think about anything beyond that, of any flexibility. So having the payment terms specified helps avoid these things. If somehow a significant long-term contract is issued without payment terms being identified, a contract modification should be executed to correct this omission. You want to correct it as soon as possible to get it standardized as to what are the rules in the future so you don't continue to have problems each time a bill comes in. Get it settled once and for all, and then you should get back on board with that good working relationship. Hopefully with mutual agreement and maintaining the concept of only paying for performance, but if need be, such terms should be implemented via change order. And a change order is something we will describe later that is a unilateral modification that is ordered by the procurement officer. And only the procurement can do a change order. Only the procurement officer can do a change order, not the contract manager. Yes.
Why would that not be called a modification?
Modification is mutual agreement. It is a modification, but it's a unilateral modification versus a mutual modification. And what that means, if you have mutual agreement, both parties are agreeing to do something for a given time frame, for a given price, you should not have any dispute over what is to be done since you have mutual agreement. If you have a change order, and a change order is only done when you can't get the vendor to agree to what you want them to do, and you're saying, you won't agree, but I, the state, need this. I don't have time to be arguing about it and figuring it out and going to arbitration or anything else. I need it, so I am going to order you, vendor, to do what I say. And what you know is going to happen is they're going to end up filing a claim, that you're going to have to then deal with the claim, and neither party knows what they're going to end up getting paid for what you're ordering them to do, which means you're not in perhaps a harmonious relationship, and you may have problems. Anytime you have a claim, there's always potential for some hard feelings. But if you get to a change order, that means they're not in agreement with what you want them to do, and they're going to file a claim with how much they think it's going to cost them, how much they want, and either you're going to agree with that or you're going to disagree, and it may go to the Board of Contract Appeals, and it's a lot of headaches. So you try not to do it. Let's see, although not making a payment under the agency until the agency believes it is merited likely will have the same effect. If you simply withhold payment, they're going to get to filing a claim. And either way, a contractor can file a claim if it believes it's been unfairly treated. A claim, something I said I think on the second day, means they are filing for damages. We don't call it damages, but we call it a claim. What it means is I have been harmed, whichever party is filing the claim, and here's the amount of money I think I have been harmed by the action or inaction of the other party. Pay me this money and I'll be okay. Don't pay me this money, I'm going to have problems. That's damages. Tools for measuring progress. Contractor's contract management plan, which may have been mentioned somewhere around slide 187. And that is where you require the contractor for this type of contract to give typically a draft in their proposal if this is evaluated. But even if it's not an evaluated procurement, you want them to give you a formal plan within so many days of the contract starting, either before or after, of exactly what they're going to do when. So you have not specified, you may have specified when the whole activity needs to be completed, but you may not have specified when each intermediate activity is to be done. But you can say to the vendor, give me your contract management plan, where the vendor is going to say, I'm going to have this done 2 weeks after start date. I'm going to have this done a month after start date, this 6 weeks after start date, etc. And so if you have that, their plan for when they were supposed to do things, and they send you a bill, well, then you can simply match up the bill with their own contract management plan and see whether the bill is for an activity that they said they were going to have done by that point in time. If it was an activity that's supposed to be done 2 weeks later or a month later, you need to validate whether they are ahead of schedule or whether they're simply billing you for an activity they haven't done yet. If they're billing for something they haven't done, you don't pay. If they are ahead of schedule and that's an okay activity and they billed according to something that proves they're ahead of schedule, go ahead and pay for it because you've actually gotten the work. Work breakdown structure. That's going to be described a fair amount hereafter, so I won't say anything more on this slide because I'm going to say a lot more about it on other slides. Timeline chart, frequently called a Gantt chart. Again, it's sort of like the contract management plan, where it has a breakdown by time of each activity. What's going to be done when? So you know what the vendor said was supposed to be done, thus when they should be billing. Contract payment terms, what you've said in your specifications, and something called the burn rate. And I remember the first time I heard burn rate, I said, what are we doing? Are we setting something on fire? and it had to be explained to me. And I'm going to explain it to you. And some of you, this is probably well-known terminology. But at one point, I hadn't heard any of this. We're going to start off with the burn rate. This is a commonly used term that simply means the percentage of the contract value that has been billed by the contractor compared to the percentage of the contract term that has expired. I.e., example, if a contract is to run 1 year with a not to exceed amount of 1.2 million, and you'll marvel at how these things work out so evenly. Just happened that way, I don't know. All other things being equal, the billings under the contract should equal about 8.3% per month, or about $100,000. If it's a 1-year contract for 1.2 million on a monthly basis, there should be, if everything is done equally, a bill for about $100,000, or about 8.3% of the contract. If after 2 months of the 1-year term, the contractor has billed $400,000, now that is a burn rate of 33 1/3%, because 400,000 is 33 1/3% of 1.2 million. Obviously, 33 1/3% is far more than the less than 8%, because if it's 8.3% a month, 2 months is 16.6%. So if they've billed you for 400,000, when all other things being equal, they should have been billing you for only 16.6%, or around 200,000. You have an issue that you have to reconcile. And that issue is, are they going ahead of schedule, in which they're entitled to the 400,000, or have they billed you 400 for 200,000 worth of work? That's the issue. So the immediate question is whether this billing or burn rate is appropriate versus essentially paying in advance for performance not yet rendered, which is bad, and for the most part we don't want to do. So that's real simple, the burn rate. How much are they billing you for versus how much would you expect billing to be for that point in the contract term. Work breakdown structure, and we're going to go through a fair amount of that. Starting with the timeline chart, we talked about the Gantt chart. Once the burn rate is calculated, it should be compared to other indices to determine if the billing should be paid. We know what they're billing. We know what the normal burn rate would be. Now we have to see whether we pay or don't pay. For major contracts, frequently the contractor will be required to provide a work breakdown structure and a timeline chart. We're going to use just the abbreviations. A major contract, frequently in your specifications, you're going to require the vendor to provide these things. If it's evaluated, you want them in the technical proposal. So you can evaluate as part of the technical proposal, number one, does the vendor seem to know what they're talking about? Do they seem to have the proper sequence of activities? That, yes, this should happen after this other thing, not before it. Do they have what seems to be a proper time frame? Are they doing something that normally takes a year, seemingly in 2 months? So do they seem to know what they're talking about? Do they have the resources that seemingly will be adequate to back up their structure and their time frame? You evaluate this, and if you have any questions, you query the vendor on it, and you make sure that you're comfortable before you award to a vendor. And then once you award, you have these as contract deliverables that you will look at as part of compliance. That takes care of the last bullet. Have them draft, which can be changed during the sealed proposal process. And they will finalize it after the contract is awarded. Now, what is a work breakdown structure? This is a detailed dismantling of the contract requirements to identify all significant component pieces. It's basically telling the vendor, if it's, I guess the easiest thing might be construction. If you're supposed to build a 5-story building, tell us now everything that goes into building that 5-story building. Tell us what each component is going to be, when it's going to be, and when it can be started, when it's going to be completed. For instance, when are you going to dig the foundation? When are you going to dig the hole in the ground? When are you going to put connect the electricity, the sewage, the water, things of that nature in the ground that are going to start coming up through the building? When are you going to pour the concrete for the base? When are you going to put up the supporting structure? When are you going to do the first floor? When the second floor? All of that should be broken down. When you're going to put in the plumbing system, the electrical system, the heating system, everything is going to be in there. So that if they bill you for something, you know when they were supposed to do it, and you can go and look and see whether it's done. Or have an inspector go and see whether it's done. But you have their own structure, breakdown structure, as to when they were supposed to do it. Construction's easy, other things are more difficult. If it's an IT project where they're supposed to come up with a solution for the year 2000 problem that fortunately didn't turn out to be much of a problem. But if you remember back before the year 2000, it was the sky is falling.
Amen.
Because once it goes over from 1999 to 2000, there is going to be supposedly thousands of places in computer codes where it cannot start with the letter 2, a number 2. That it's only programmed to start with a 19 or something like that, and it won't know what to do with a 2. Or it's only been because of such the expense of memory, they only had allowed 2 digits for the year. 50, 90, whatever, because it was understood it was 19. And when you roll over to 2000, it's going to read it as 2090, not 1990, etc., and it won't know what to do with it. So supposedly the sky was falling. And so there were contracts awarded to remediate all the software everywhere in the universe, to detect every place where it had a date where it could potentially cause a problem. If you remember, there was concern that the banks were not going to be able to do transactions. Something as simple as supplying water. Couldn't get water, couldn't get sewage, couldn't get money, that alarms wouldn't work. Nothing would, the possibility was nothing was going to work. And I can remember before the year 2000, before the stroke of midnight, there were emergency crews on standby from utilities and emergency from police and fire just in case. And the other thing I remember was supposedly the prison doors for many prisons were going to automatically come open on the stroke of midnight. And I don't know if many of you remember this, but I was a little bit more concerned because I did the procurement to get the vendors to do the remediation for all the state's programs. And I was in all these meetings about all these disasters, and I'm like, do I want to go to a deserted island somewhere and come back in a couple years? And they told you to stock in water and various things just in case, have money on hand in case something would happen. So if you're dealing with the unknown, how do you give a work breakdown structure of what you're going to do for something that's never been done? So that's what we're talking about sometimes when we say, sometimes it's easy and sometimes it isn't. So one of the key things is when it isn't, try to put as much of it back on the vendor for them to tell you, so you at least have their own determination and estimation of when things should happen. All right, this detailed dismantling of the contract requirements to identify significant component pieces. The solicitation can specify how finite this breakdown has to be. Examples. It could be specified that any individual component activity requiring at least 100 person-hours of effort be identified. This is just an example. I'm not going to tell you what's going to take 100 hours, but I'm going to tell you, vendor, anything that you think is going to take 100 hours, at least 100 hours, you identify in your work breakdown structure what that activity is and when that activity is going to happen. So you're telling me. Another example of the 100-hour threshold, parsing this a little more. The 100-hour threshold could be the minimum, so it could be anything over 100 up to like 10,000, or we can say we want everything broken down by no more than 100 hours. So we want you to break down, even if something is a 10,000-hour activity, break that 10,000 hours into 100-hour increments and tell me when each is going to happen. So these are things we can specify. And a lot of you are thinking, forget it, I'm not even going to go there. But anyway, these are things you can't happen. Or the specification could take a different approach and state that component activities would have to be continually broken down until no component exceeded a given level of effort, i.e., you keep drilling down further and further until you get into these little bits of 100-hour increments by the example I'm giving. This approach essentially means the contract is broken down into small bite-sized pieces if we specify that. And the reason why you might specify that is the standpoint of being able to understand what is being done when. Under the premise that small pieces are easier to monitor than large components or the contract as a whole, both in terms of whether the component was completed as required and when it was completed. If something takes 10,000 hours, it may be hard to know when that 10,000 hour activity is done or how much of it's been done. If we're saying, give it to me in 100-hour or 500-hour increments, then it's a lot easier to see whether something that is a small part is done than a huge whole. So that's why you would do this type of thing. And you have to decide which type of contracts are appropriate for this. Or under sealed proposals, offers could have the flexibility as to how detailed to make their work breakdown structure. We don't tell them, we tell them, you tell us how you're breaking it down and the rationale for selecting whatever breakdown that you have. If you're doing it by 1,000-hour increments, 500-hour increments, 100-hour increments, you decide what is appropriate and you decide, and tell us why you did it that way.
And what that does is that will reflect their understanding of the project and the schedule and the allocation of appropriate resources at various points along the schedule. It basically tell you if they understand what it is they get themselves into.
Which is this point right here.
Okay.
I.e., the degree to which offerers on their own break down the components of contract performance can be considered under an appropriate evaluation factor. Under the premise that the more formalized and detailed an offerer structures its efforts to perform under a contract, the more likely it will recognize the steps and activities needed to properly perform the contract, and if it recognizes it, it's more likely to perform it if it knows what's supposed to be done.
It also may show the various approaches that several contractors may take. There could be varying approaches to completing a project, and this will allocate and identify what each contractor is going to do, when they're going to do it, to achieve the ultimate goal. So there may be different approaches to the same solution, and this breakdown will show that.
There can be different approaches, different levels of intensity, and if you understand sealed proposals, we get both a technical offering and a price, and we select on the most advantageous offer, which supposedly somehow brings together what they're doing and how much they're paying for it, how much they're charging for it. And we can take the most advantageous offer, which means best value, which does not have to be the lowest bidder. And one of the things that you might do to determine the most advantageous offer is look at the level of activity by the breakdown of resources and things like that. If they've detailed how many people and how many resources they're putting into it, that might explain why there might be a significant price difference from a vendor that's going to have a whole lot of resources versus a vendor that isn't going to apply many resources at all. And then what you have to decide is which one is right necessarily. Is the one what we call over-speccing or over-resourcing it, and they don't need that and they're charging too much, it's not worth what they're doing, or is someone else under-analyzing, under-preparing, and probably won't be able to perform for what they've said. So having this level of detail lets you make an evaluation of who really knows what they're talking about. And as I said this morning, that's part of the issue of can they perform. If they can evidence to you that they know the steps, they know the sequences, they know the needed resources, it's likely that these people know what they're talking about and can actually perform. Conversely, a vendor that comes up and has a very skimpy breakdown structure, and you ask them through the cure process to, well, can you break this down further? We need more information about when people are going to be brought in and when different resources are going to be brought in. And if they come back and say, well, we've given you the best we can, that's the most that we can let you know about how we're going to do this. That's telling you volumes about the vendor and their understanding of your project. So it's possible you will not even find that type of vendor reasonably susceptible being selected for award and never open their price. But it all gets down to what you've told them to do and how well they've done it. And aside from evaluating, then you have it from the standpoint of once you've awarded, then you pay according to work done by these structures. Okay, any questions on that? And I'm probably going to mention it other times later, but that is the primary explanation for a work breakdown structure. Timeline chart. This is a detailed chart showing when each major contract component will be initiated, and the usual time frame is from the contract start date. That usually they will do, because there's always, we know when we expect a contract to be awarded, but often it doesn't happen by that time. And so if the vendor simply says from contract start date, then they can say how long from that date, whatever that date is. Activity 1 will start on contract commencement date and take 8 weeks to complete, or activity 2 won't start until 8 weeks after contract commencement. So it's all in their timeline. So when each major contract component will be initiated and completed, and the completion usually is from contract start date. So that if you have component X up here that is going to be initiated 8 weeks after contract commencement and completed 12 weeks after contract commencement, anyone can do the math? How long is it going to take to do the work? A month or 4 weeks. If they're going to start at 8 weeks and complete in 12 weeks, there's 4 weeks difference. So that's what they're telling you it's going to take to do that activity. And you can see, if you have expertise in their proposal, whether you think that's an appropriate time frame, both for when they're starting it and how long they're going to take to complete it. The elapsed time between these two dates shows how long the component is projected to take to complete, 4 weeks. Using this timeline chart, once the contract actually begins, all component start and end dates can be converted to specific dates. So generically, in the proposal, without getting to a start date, they can say it's going to start 8 weeks after commencement and end 12 weeks later. When you make the award and actually give them the notice to proceed, and let's say we give them notice that says start on December 15th, then they should come back and give you an updated timeline chart, which now puts real dates in there. We're going to start it on December 15th, and we're going to, the contract will start on December 15th. Component X will start on February 15th, something like that, and can be completed on March 15th, so you have actual dates. But that's a timeline chart. Converting components start in 8 days specific dates, so that's just what I said there. And these two things work together. You have them break down the components and into the various, the work breakdown structure, and give you the timeline for each thing they've broken down by this structure, so you can marry not only what they're doing, but when they're doing it. After award, the selected offeror shall be required within a specified number of days to update its draft, work breakdown structure, and timeline completion, timeline chart, with actual dates, with the revision needing agency approval, if there is anything other than what they had said before. The contract should require the contractor to periodically or as needed, based upon changing circumstances, update the work breakdown structure timeline chart throughout the entire contract duration, so that you always have a current, correct breakdown structure and timeline for anything that's changed, and you will have the documentation of the change if there is a change, and then you have what they're supposed to be doing no matter when it is in the contract, so you know when they're entitled to payment. Let's see. which would make this a deliverable that the agency contract manager should ensure occurs. So if you have that incorporated as part of the contract, these things are contractual requirements. They now become deliverables. And deliverables are what trigger payment, the completion of deliverables. We're still on the subject of measuring progress. By examining the contractor's work breakdown structure and timeline chart, it should be much easier to tell what activities were projected to be completed as of each billing period, which will help determine if the contractor's burn rate or their billing seems to be appropriate. But aside from what was projected to be completed by a given date, it must be determined if the activity actually was completed as projected, which gets back to the acceptance criteria. What is required to prove they did something, and even if they projected doing it, we have to validate they did it and did it as we required them to do by the criteria we specified for the acceptance of a deliverable.
Some of these large major projects, you have payments tied to these schedules and tied to these completion dates. You have payments tied to the work breakdown and tied to the timelines. And depending on where they are in a certain timeline, dictates how much money they're going to be paid, as opposed to waiting to the end of the project to pay these people. You pay them through the course of the project, providing you've got clear identified timelines and milestones that upon, yes, we've completed it by this date, yes, we've accepted it by this date, then we'll pay you this much as of this date. So it's a great mechanism to provide progress payments through the course of a very long project. I was involved in a $1 million project that lasted a long time. We did
He needs to speak into the microphone.
overhaul of the subway cars at the Transit Administration, and the Gantt chart, the timeline chart, the work breakdown schedule chart that went with this project was so big that it literally took up 3 sides of a room. That's how big of that's how many components were in this chart, and that's how long the project was. And really, without something like that, you could never manage that project. There were just so many moving parts. You needed to know where you were on each specific day, what had been done, what was waiting to be done, what was to be done next, to make sure everything was, because it's a production schedule, so you needed to make sure everything was running in accordance with the proper schedule. So, and there's also incentive for the contractors because they want to get paid through the life of this project as well. So, very useful tool.
Yes. And this is part of the activity that lets you know, does the vendor seem like it's going to get done with the whole project when it's supposed to? If you know they're missing the first, the second, the third activities that they break down, then you got problems. And you have to either start remediation right then or start thinking about changing vendors. Maybe very early on. You don't wait until the contract's supposed to be done and find out, oh, they just didn't get it done. That doesn't give you much recourse at that point in time. Let's see. Aside with what was projected to be completed by a given date, it must be determined. Oh, I already said that. Okay. Positive time reporting. So any questions on that? Positive time reporting. This is something we're talking about, labor hour billing.
You're not going to get through this.
I'm not going to get through this. How many slides do I have on this?
It's half a dozen.
Are you suggesting we let them go
I am.
8 minutes before the appointed time?
Yes.
No, I'm going home.
All in favor? Opposed?
I guess we're going to lunch, come back at 1 o'clock.